Hey everybody, we're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Kristen.
I'm Dr. Erin.
And you are very welcome to our second book, second chapter of Colonizer's World Tour, where we are going to be focusing entirely on the country of Brazil. And the reason that we are focusing entirely on the country of Brazil is that one could focus on it until, the Lord comes back and you still will not understand Brazil. But we're going to spend 4 weeks trying to get our arms around a couple different topics. And the one that we wanted to start with first is, the biggest one in a certain way, and it is the political and economic system and economic structures of Brazil, especially in terms of the 2010s. The economy and politics were linked really closely, and and how that looks like. And so we want to talk about that. Today we're going to be breaking down some ways that the economy affects both the country in terms of their people, the country in terms of their land. Then tomorrow we're going to be talking about a documentary that is highly acclaimed and came out in 2019 called The Edge of Democracy. And we have a lot of thoughts on that. It mostly covers Operation Car Wash and the Petrobras Scandal, and kind of the outcomes and fallouts of all of that. Which we feel is an important thing to it's an important piece of art to this conversation. So we'll be covering that a little bit more tomorrow. But today we're going to do, in the spirit of our 101 videos, a bit of a 30,000 foot view as to how the structures are kind of operating and working. I am positive we are going to make mistakes in this. And I am positive that I'm going to read something tomorrow that contradicts something I say in this. And so I'm going to say that as of March 11th, 2002, 2022, here is what we think we know about the economy of Brazil.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. So before we start, Erin,
Yeah.
What do you feel you were coming into this week with? What did you know?
Yeah, I mean, basically what I learned from our coverage on the Colonizer's World Tour last year, it's a the thing that struck me when we covered it last year and revisiting a lot of stuff this year. It's a really big country, y'all.
It's so massive, physically massive.
Physically massive. And which makes it really difficult to have economic policies like Hello United States that are applicable and enforced in equal measures around the country. So that is one thing I felt like I knew. Shocking absolutely no one. I have focused on the impact of Bolsonaro's economic interests on the indigenous peoples of the Amazon rainforest. I remembered a lot that was a rabbit hole I fell down last year. So I didn't fall down the rabbit hole this year, but I was like, yes, I remember all of this. So obviously I'll be covering the intersection of the economy and indigenous folks in a few minutes. How about yourself? What was what did you feel like you maybe knew?
I knew that Operation Car Wash was a deal. I didn't really understand its ramifications, but I knew it was important. And I knew that it was part of BRIC. And so in the early 2000s, we thought that it was going to become one of the world's leading economies, and they were going to transition to possibly even being a superpower, and that this hasn't happened. And I was curious as to why. I fell down some more cultural rabbit holes last year when we did Colonizer's World Tour, really interested in gender and favelas and some other stuff like that. And so in this one, I dove into the business owner aspect, shocking no one, and really wanted to figure out how businesses function within this economy, which is why I finally, thank you Brazil, understand what the middle wage gap is in global politics. And so I'm going to dive into that now, and I'm going to offer our overview and some of the more basic kind of economic and political realities of what's going into. And then Dr. Erin's got two in particular intersections of humans that we're going to talk about before we close this out. So despite a lot of drama, Brazil is the largest economy in Latin America, and it's the ninth largest in the world. So even though the BRIC prophecy has not rung completely true, it's still a very powerful economy. It is mixed in terms of use of natural resources versus other sectors. So, for instance, its three biggest outports, its three biggest products in a way, are coffee, rubber, and oil. And those are massive. Coffee, rubber, and oil are really big deals. But they also have, tourism is also an industry and some other things like that. They're not purely agro and they're not purely tech. They really do kind of mix both. there was a ton of rapid growth. They were affected by the global recession, but really not really. Most of Latin America wasn't really as much because the banks are just slightly different. But so their recession hit them hard and fast in 2014. And it was really a thing. One of the other things to keep in mind that I find absolutely fascinating is that it is one of the world's leading producers of animal proteins. Like, in 2019, it was the largest exporter of chicken meat in the world. Okay.
Like,
had no idea.
No idea. No idea. That was almost my Jeopardy fun fact. Because I was just like, chicken meat?
Yeah.
Cool.
So the original kind of cash crop of Brazil was sugar. It's what the Portuguese really exploited for a long time. And then obviously the gold and the gold mines that they found. Those were kind of their two biggest ones. Oil wasn't found until like the 90s, 2000s. So they weren't a big oil superpower and still aren't. They have reserves, but they're not like on the same scale as Saudi Arabia or Iran or UAE. It's just not the same conversation. But the economy was built on slave labor. We just need to call that out. And so it's never achieved any level of equity at all. And it still functions like a slave labor economy. We just pay people a slight pittance. There is no minimum wage. I don't know if Brazil will ever introduce a minimum wage. And even if there is a minimum wage, the diversity of industries is so incredibly wide, and they still do have such a huge agro population. I don't know any country in the world that offers minimum wage for like coffee pickers. Yeah. And so it's gonna look really different. We're gonna talk about in a couple seconds, the Bolsa Familia, I think is what it's called. It was the government program that President Lula brought in to essentially try to give poor families a leg up in some way, shape, or form. And I'm going to get to that in a little bit about why that was so important. So in the 1930s, there was a revolution. Then we also get this massive military dictatorship for a hot minute / 20 years that the United States installed. We covered a lot of this during the history of colonization. We'll link last year's coverage in the show notes below, as well as our living resource document on the country of Brazil, where all of our resources that we have found for the economy are going to get added to that sheet. And so we're just going to keep growing that Google Doc. We will separate out the resources. So if you're just looking for the economy, there will be a section of articles and videos just on the economy. So you don't have to hunt through everything else. Two of its big kind of events in terms of the economy is that in 1994, it pegged its currency, which is the real and still is, to the US dollar. It changed it to a free float in 1999. And why this is so important is that meant that the internal banks have the entire control over inflation. And when we fast forward to 2016, that's going to become a really big deal. It did have to get a IMF relief package in the mid-2000s. It repaid it in 2005. But the real big deal is that corruption just costs everybody a lot of money. Mm. A country built entirely on slave labor is also entirely built on corruption. And it has never progressed past that culture of corruption. And if you watch news reports and you listen to sociologists and economists talk, there's not actually a lot of aspiration for it to. Mm. There's a desire, but no one has a plan for actually how to root out corruption. Because the last person that tried to do it got impeached. And
it didn't go well for her.
Didn't go super well. Joma. And the dude in power now is a big fan of it and thinks that it's kind of how things work. So I'm not entirely sure. There's a desire of people on the ground. I always think so much, more than any country we've studied, to be completely honest, the economic policies of the people in power and the people on the ground are so disparate. I find the smallest percentage of the population in agreement with the government's economic policies of nearly every other country we've covered.
Yeah, they just have a chokehold on it.
And it's like 9 families control all the media, for example. So it's probably like 25 families that control the whole country. Mm. And there's a lot of legacy land ownership, legacy slavery, inheritance. There's a lot of generational everything. So the main issues, the key issues to understand the economy, we've broken this down into 4 things. And the first one is this global middle class gap. And I'm going to get into that in a second because, you guys, I understand it. This was a question on my AP economics exam, and I didn't get it right, and it has kind of been bugging me ever since. The second thing you have to understand is the incredible systemic corruption, like we just said.
Oof.
But it feels like an understatement to call it systemic corruption. I don't know quite how to. When we get to talking about Operation Car Wash and Petrobras, maybe you'll get a better scope of really what we're talking about here. And the Edge of Democracy documentary makes it, it really brings it home.
Yeah.
So the third thing is how they manage natural resources, which Dr. Aaron's going to get into. For instance, deforestation has skyrocketed in the last 2 years because of President Bolsonaro and his particular feelings about land and human beings. So Aaron's going to get into that. And the fourth thing we've got to talk about, and we have to talk about in every single, honestly, we're not talking about it enough on Colonizer's World Tour because we don't have data yet, but hopefully we will soon, is the COVID. We got to talk about the COVID. So I'm going to cover the first two here, and then Aaron's going to cover the last two plus some additional surprises and fun facts for you. All right. In terms of the middle class gap, so developing nations can become competitive in a global market by offering cheap labor. We now see this in Taiwan. We see this in parts of China. But in the 90s, this was Brazil. Brazil could offer cheap labor to international corporations who came in and give that. The issue is that this eventually leads to a skilled workforce who can make somewhere between $10,000 and $20,000 a year. But then that means they're not cheap labor anymore. So now we get stagnation, and you go into the low growth gap as well, where no one really knows what to do because these foreign companies are like, deuces, my costs are skyrocketing and I'm leaving. But they haven't, because of either the length of time or the corruption in their country, they don't have any innovation pipelines to replace those foreign nationals. So everyone just gets stuck in this. And I should say, this is a great reminder that the global middle class is $10,000 to $20,000 US dollars a year. Mm. So when we talk about global economics, we need to keep in mind that to get out of poverty in many countries is $10,000 salary a year. So when I'm talking about cheap labor, we're talking about paying people 70 cents a day.
Yeah.
$1 a day. Well below any sort of standardized minimum wage anywhere on the planet. The way out of this is innovation. There's a couple really great videos in the resource lists that explain this. The countries that have gotten out of it, Japan was in this bucket for a little while. China was in this bucket for a lot longer. Some of China is still in this bucket, but nationally, innovation is how you get out of it. Now, China's innovating by copying existing IP, but they're still technically innovating. Technically. We were this for a little while too, in some ways, and we got out through innovation. And so that's how you get out of the middle class gap, the middle class stagnation. Brazil, from what I'm reading from economists, global economists have limited hope that Brazil will get out of this quickly because of the policies of Bolsonaro's government do not encourage innovation. They encourage the status quo in a lot of ways. They encourage things to keep going. But they were not saying that Lula's was encouraging innovation either, or that Rousseff's was encouraging innovation. Innovation has not been a governmental priority. It has even further stagnated because of the way that Bolsonaro has structured a few things. But I don't want anyone to think that the two previous presidents were doing gangbusters in innovation. No, it's just never been part of the program. And one of those is because it has stagnated at the production level instead of the innovation. And with production always comes corruption. Mm. The global economists say that these two things always go hand in hand. And if anything that Brazil is really good at, besides growing really delicious bananas, is corruption. And this is where we're going to talk about Operation Car Wash. Whew. So in 2016, this is very brief. In 2016, it came to light that the largest, the national oil company, Petrobras, has gotten all of its various contracts with construction companies, has been accompanied by bribes. And those bribes were also taken by high-level government officials. Like half of President Lula's cabinet, it appears, like lots of really high-ranking government officials took these bribes to facilitate these deals. Why this is a particularly big deal is that the party in power at the time was founded by trade unionists and was known as the Workers' Party. The incredible betrayal that we see the Brazilian people addressing is what has then led to an incredible fracture within the country. Is the words, the emotions around this idea of you promised us you were different and you are exactly the same and maybe even worse. And I watched some videos where people were like, I personally trusted President Lula. I personally trusted him. And he oversaw this. Now, we're going to get into it in The Edge of Democracy. There's actually lots of conversations about, like, what did Lula know and what did he participate in. There's no evidence he ever actually took a bribe. Even though he was sent to jail for taking a bribe, there's no actual clear evidence. But regardless, his party broke trust with the people, which then people that were already frustrated with his party, it's like he gave them permission to say all of this is a lie. All of communism is a lie. Socialism is a lie. They never had either one of those things. But they had things that kind of looked like it maybe. And they used the color red, which was a poor marketing decision if you were trying not to be a communist. And we hit 2016, and people are at protests wearing red, and they're arrested for wearing even that color. And you start to set up a movement where there's people wearing red and there's people wearing the Brazilian flag, and who gets to be the most Brazilian, which is a conversation that we know from in 2016. This started in 2014 and 2015, and reached a climax in 2016. But we have that story in the UK and the US as well. Who gets to be British? Who gets to be American? Who gets to be real? What does great mean? We had all these conversations too. So P.S. This was happening parallel in Brazil at the same time. The recession from 2014 and 2016 did not really end, and then the COVID. And it is still dire straits in Brazil for the majority of the population. The economic inequity is entrenched. And the outcome of Operation Car Wash was really just that a bunch of people lost their jobs. It didn't fix anything. Just a lot of people lost their jobs. They should have lost their jobs. But in a government system where like a third of each of the houses of Congress has been indicted or convicted of crimes, I am not entirely sure what fixing it looks like. And I don't know how much longer you can sustain any level of a functional economy with this level of corruption in a country this big, with a president who seems to believe that their ticket out is by strip mining the Amazon, which is not a renewable resource decision. So we have gotten on the we are now interested in Brazil train. For sure, we'll be following the election. The next general election happens in October. I certainly have ordered more books. I'm following more Brazilian media. I've discovered that there is a Love is Blind Brazil on Netflix, which very quickly may become my next binge watch. So we're going to be keeping our eyes on this, and I'm really hoping that I can learn more about the economy in particular and what manufacturing and industry brings into this, because those resources were a little bit harder for me to find in English. And so I will say there's a gap here on that. But according to global economists, unless they figure out innovation and they figure it out fast, this is the stagnation, is this kind of level of minor recession until they figure out something else. So now we're going to move on to natural resources, our third point. Let's do the COVID first, because that's a good transition point before we go. So what we know is that the COVID killed 1 in 500 Brazilians. And that there were emergency cash payments in 2020, but they ran out in 2021. And so any sort of economically positive effects have been mitigated by now. There is no more cash coming into people. And I believe 52% of the country is currently unemployed. Something like that.
Really high.
It's real high. It's really high. So that's all not really great. And as Aaron will talk about, a huge part of the population is indigenous tribes that don't count into those statistics. And so we probably have even higher unemployment and backbreaking poverty than we have with those statistics. So now let us go to natural resources. Aaron, what can you tell us about strip mining the Amazon?
Yeah, so it's not great. Especially under Bolsonaro. And, you know, as we talk about colonization and on the Colonizers World Tour, we always talk about the indigenous populations that are impacted. And so I really wanted to look specifically at what the economy looks like for indigenous folks. And there were 2.5 million people living in the land that became Brazil at the time of colonization. And there's a rich history that we got into in our Brazil 101 in terms of diverse people groups and languages and cultures and all of that. But a huge issue for indigenous people almost everywhere is land and water protection. And very often this comes into, conflict with economic interests, especially in terms of land development. So anything that will negatively impact indigenous land, food, and water access is a huge issue for the indigenous populations in Brazil. And Bolsonaro was elected in October of 2016. And, we'll get into more of what happened and why that election happened when we talk about Edge of Democracy. But it's one of these things that happens in Brazil where the perception of corruption within the government leads to a pendulum swing in leadership. And so the perception of corruption and the actual corruption within the Workers' Party and within Dilma Rousseff and Lula's presidencies, pendulum swung to the PSNB, I think, the far right party, which Bolsonaro was a member of. And, that was the party that is, kind of the old boys club of the Brazilian Congress, houses of Congress, in that corruption is just how things are done. That's how people get deals made. The best way to help the country is to develop the economy. And that's always, alongside corruption, there's always been this concern about economic development. And so Bolsonaro takes that lead and runs with it. So he's real big on hydroelectric, mining, and gold, almost all of which is resources that are located in the Amazon rainforest. So deforestation is a huge issue. And the advancing industrialization is having a huge impact on the climate of the Amazon, which is not only not great for the indigenous peoples who live there, but it's not great for all of us, folks, because the Amazon rainforest is so big and has such an impact on the global climate that the deforestation and mining down there is really bad for all of us. So we've seen a huge rise in the last 5 or 6 years in indigenous protests. And again, in the Google Sheet, there's links to protests that have taken place in Brasilia and all of this. So there is a literal direct connection between business and economic concerns from Brazil's political parties and the threat to the land and resources of the indigenous people. I learned about something called the Trans-Amazonian Highway, which decimated, and I believe they mean that literally, several indigenous populations and is also a failure. The opening of roads and waterways to export grains and minerals is a huge part of the country's pillars of infrastructure, but there's always consequences for that. So the mining on indigenous lands is a huge national controversy, and a lot of this has placed Brazil in an international spotlight that it didn't want to be in because of those ramifications for the environment. And so all of that is really harming the indigenous people groups that live in the area of the Amazon. They had very high rates of disease distribution because the mining development means it's easier to spread diseases because people are coming from the outside in and spreading diseases like malaria, but also COVID-19, which ravaged Indigenous communities. And there was a lot of vaccine hesitancy in terms of the cultural and religious beliefs of the Indigenous peoples. And so they had high rates of disease and death. And I watched a whole video on, like, I think it was in Papua New Guinea, on how hard it was to get Indigenous groups in Papua New Guinea to come to COVID clinics and, like, believe that COVID wasn't from the devil.
Yeah.
So that was also the kind of the intersection of COVID in that. So, you know, the natural resources continues to be an issue, but also the other intersection that I wanted to focus on was the impact of the economy on disabled Brazilians. And this is the flip side to the natural resources. So Brazil has an abundant natural resources, but they have to bring in a lot of other things that aren't natural resources. And a lot of that is adaptive materials for disabled folks. And so the recession had a real impact. And I watched a couple of fascinating news pieces about how hard it was for disabled folks in Brazil to get, like, wheelchairs. And how after the recession, because the price was so high for the importing of these goods that they couldn't afford to get them. And it's also, you know, worth mentioning that there's always a class issue, especially with ability. And you don't have to spend much time watching footage of favelas to understand how difficult it is to be a person with disabilities in these places that are literally, like, outside the bounds of government. I watched a video with a man who's a photographer, and he's wheelchair bound, and he has to wait outside of his apartment because there's only steps to get into his house until somebody walks by whom he trusts to lift him in, and can wait upwards of 3 hours for somebody to just dander on by who can help him. But this led me down the rabbit hole of looking at the issue of ability and disability in Brazil. So from the 2010 census, we know that about 16 million people, or 8.3% of the population, have a severe form of disability. Of this 16 million, 9 million are of working age, but only 1 million are in the labor force. But there's also 45 million people, or almost 24% of Brazilians, who live with some form of disability. So they have some really interesting laws that would appear that they care about equity in terms of ability, but, you know, laws and then implementation are two different things usually. They passed a law in 2016 called the Law on the Inclusion of Persons with Disabilities, which means right to work, right to, non-discrimination, all of that. But they have a mandate for quota of disabled people, which is dependent on the size of the business.
Sure.
They have to offer on-the-job training to disabled people who have the qualification but lack the experience, and they are required to provide reasonable accommodation, which we have here in the States as well. The law mandates universal design, not only for the physical environment and transportation, but for information and communication systems and technologies. Again, whether the law is implemented in places, but I found that to be really progressive in terms of mandating accessibility. But as I said, the prolonged recession meant rising costs for adaptive technology. And so it was a lot more difficult for people with disabilities to get the access that they needed to be fully participating members of society. And for me, that opened my eyes to start thinking about the accessibility of that kind of technology in the United States, and if it's something similar when there's economic issues.
We have factories here that make wheelchairs, so there's got to be at least somewhat of an easier. I mean, I know it's hard all the time, but at least we don't have to import them. I don't know.
Guess. Yeah. So that's the legal side of things. What's codified in terms of what's actually practicable or what actually happens. There's a report from the Human Rights Watch in 2018 that there are high numbers of children and adults with disabilities who are needlessly confined in institutions where they face high levels of neglect and abuse. This is where, like, so the law protects people, but what does the culture think about people with disabilities? So very often people end up in institutions because their families either struggle to care for them or they don't want to care for them because they are disabled. So access to all of these lovely laws really depends on class, which really also depends on race in Brazil and skin color. So that is a huge part of how and when people with disabilities are able to participate in society and therefore in the economy. But, you know, it's one of the intersections that we always want to talk about, but don't often go so into such a deep dive. And once I found all that stuff about the legal changes in Brazil, I was like, oh, this is fascinating. But before we get to our Jeopardy fun fact, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the impact of colonization on the economy. But y'all, it was a slave economy for hundreds of years. So, I mean, there's that. But it was a really long colonization from Portugal. And one of the resources I found argued that this meant that, like, all the pre-industrial economic policies were shaped by enslavement and trade and commerce that was dictated by Portuguese interests. So the trade policies, what was imported, what was exported, how the economy was set up was dictated by a place very far across the ocean. And their, you know, participation in the European economy and all of this. So that's always important to remember in terms of the impact of colonization on long-term economic interests. We learned that in The Edge of Democracy that their legal system is based on the Spanish Inquisition that was brought in by the Portuguese. And it's just like blew a couple of light bulbs in our brains when we learned that. And we'll get into that a little bit more with The Edge of Democracy in terms of the direct impact that had on the political scandals of the last 8 years. But the impact of colonization, suffice to say, is still pretty massive. As Dr. Kristen said, there's a lot of industries that still mimic the slave trade and replicate it. And when we talked about Brazil last year, we talked about the scale of the slave trade, which we did not know prior to studying Brazil. So, you know, go back to those resources or back to our video on that for a refresher if you need one. But really, when it's that massive, you're not going to ever escape that because the entire country is founded on those systems of enslavement and corruption. So that's the rest of what we've got to poke at the Brazilian economy a little bit about. It is now time for our Jeopardy fun facts. Dr. Kristen, what did you select?
You know, there was nothing super trivia-y for me. That chicken thing might be the one that I say that it's the world's largest exporter of chicken. But I really thank you for teaching me the middle class wealth gap.
Yeah,
I think that's mine. But I'll steal the chicken thing because I know that's not yours. So that's the one I'll pick.
No, mine is both about disabled folks that I learned so much about. I really loved the idea, or was interested in the idea, that they have a mandate on hiring disabled folks. I don't know enough to know if that has worked or has not worked. But I also found this video that someone produced, so we'll probably revisit it when we get to the World Cup Olympics time period. So the Paralympics were also held in Brazil, and so this investigative journalist did a 30-minute documentary on living with disabilities in Rio. And I learned that there is a samba school specifically for folks with disabilities called Ambassadors of Joy.
Love it. Amazing. We're booking them immediately.
And they have a fantastic woman with dwarfism who is like the star of the samba school. But then there's also, there's a disabled, entirely disabled run media channel And the reporter is the first head disabled reporter in the world. And she's a woman with Down syndrome. And yeah, it's just fantastic. And so I learned those little tidbits. But yeah, Ambassadors of Joy, look them up on YouTube. They lead Carnival like every year. It's just fantastic.
Oh my God, I love it.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, we are not going to be talking about joy next week. We need to kind of let you guys know that up front. So tomorrow, like we said, we're going to be talking about Edge of Democracy, but then next week we're going to get into racism and slavery. Have fun. So if you've liked this video and you've learned something, please give it a thumbs up. If you're interested in learning more, subscribe to our channel. We have lots and lots of resources around here to help you understand the human experience around the world just a little bit deeper. One of the other ways to keep in touch with us is to subscribe to our newsletter, and you'll find a link to be able to do that below. We have some really exciting things coming up in 2022, and we would love to make sure, and they're all happening off YouTube, to be honest. So we'd love to make sure you don't miss them. So sign up for that newsletter for some exclusive offers, coupon codes, and announcements. In the meantime, our hope for you is that you have a job where you are paid at least close to your worth, and definitely enough to live on, and that you are not mired in corruption, and that you have choice and agency, and find joy in what you do.
More about corruption with the Edge of Democracy. We'll see you guys then.
Bye.